who believe that their way is the right way and the other way is the wrong way, then we have the conditions for what we like to call the agile war zone. And this is where either or thinking on either side leads to misunderstandings, passive aggressive behavior, and potentially all-out war. Now, unfortunately, the agile war zone seems to exist in most organizations that do product development, or at least all of the ones that Brock and I have had the opportunity to work with. And one of the reasons why we believe that it's so prevalent is that one of the assertions that we'll make in this talk is that we believe that the war that we're fighting here is actually not even winnable by either side. And many of us have been selling Agile as a solution to problems that actually can't be solved. They can only be managed. And so you might have read, the title of our talk, Managing Agile Mixed with Waterfall, and immediately discounted us as heretics who are promoting Agile or Watergile or one of those other terms. And certainly if I had read the title of this talk, a couple of years ago, that's the first thing I would have thought of. But our intention here is merely to shift the conversation to a different perspective, one that I guess brings into the forefront the reality that Agile mixed with Waterfall is actually already happening around us in most of the corporations that are out there. And so what we're going to try to do today is equip you with some knowledge and some tools in a practical sense that can help you manage in case this happens to be your current reality.
Okay. And so, one of the ways that we can manage the war zone, as Erkan described, is with a tool called polarity thinking. And this is introduced by Barry Johnson in his book, Polarity Management, Identifying and Managing Unsolvable Problems. And I've been studying this recently, so I just happen to have it really handy here. So that's the book. Fascinating information in there if you're into digging into things like that. This idea of polarity thinking recognizes that all values come in pairs. So each value in the pair has both an upside and a downside, and there are predictable dynamics that exist and define the relationship between these two values. And so we're going to start by introducing you to polarity thinking using one of the dilemmas that Agile companies have to manage: how to support both the individual and the team. And I like to think of the metaphor of a moving walkway, kind of like this. You'll see this kind of infinity loop throughout our presentation here today. If you think of it like one of those moving walkways, it really highlights the dynamics that exist within polarities. See, as an organization favors the individual, the upside that they'll realize for a time is that of individual initiative. This is characterized by individual creativity and entrepreneurial spirit, fewer and shorter meetings, a sense of freedom, and addressing of personal needs. But given that polarity dynamics work like a moving walkway, the organization will start to experience too much of a good thing and naturally move towards the downside of the individual pole, which is isolation. And the organization might experience this as a lack of common direction, only being rewarded for home runs, no synergistic effect, no team support, and selfish me thought. Now, once in the downside of the individual pole, the organization reacts to fix the new problems that have been created and moves back into the upside, this time favoring the team pole. And this is a common shift that we see in organizations that are transitioning to agile ways of working, moving from favoring the individual to favoring the team pole. Now, where we are in the upside of the team pole, the organization now enjoys the benefits of a cohesive unit, including a common direction, recognition that each job or role is important, synergistic effect, team support, personal sacrifice in favor of team success. But remember, polarity thinking tells us that we're still on this moving walkway. And so the organization will eventually start to experience the downside of over applying the team pole should they favor it long enough. This manifests itself as bland sameness, meanings that are too many and too long, catering to the least common denominator, team burden, and neglect of personal needs. In other words, you end up with too much complexity. Now, these polarity dynamics, as we've just witnessed, are inevitable. And then the other thing I want to highlight on this slide here too is you see those two bars at the top and bottom, what we value and what we fear. And you can think of the upside and downside of the poles like that. There's things that we value about each pole, but there's also things we fear about them. And so that might be a useful way to look at this as we proceed through our talk today.
So Brock, would that be like, if we get too crazy with Waterfall, we move towards Agile, and then sometimes if we get too dogmatic about Agile, we kind of, the pendulum swings, and when it swings too far one way, that just reminds me of that. So I don't know if you guys see it that way, but.
It's not exactly that pendulum, right? If you see the dynamics with the arrows here,
more of an infinity loop,
experience the upside, but if you stay in that pole, whether it's team or individual, for too long, you'll eventually start to experience the downside. And the more you overfocus on it, the more of the downside you get. And Erkan's going to talk about this later in the presentation, but the key is to notice you're starting to experience the downside and be able to shift to the other pole for a time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the dynamic that we're talking about, because it's inevitable and you just want to be able to manage it well so you experience mostly the upsides and not a lot of downside.
Mm-hmm.
But stay tuned, we do have an example of that, and Erkan's going to share with us later about a well-managed polarity. Yes, thanks for the question. Good. So this is one of the challenges that we have in this discussion is, how do you know when you're dealing with a problem that you need to solve or a polarity to manage? And so we have 4 questions here, and answering yes to these questions tells us that we're likely dealing with a polarity to manage. Is the difficulty ongoing? Are the alternatives interdependent? Are the upsides of both poles necessary? And will overfocus on one pole undermine the greater purpose? We believe that the challenges we try and solve when we move from Waterfall to Agile are not problems, but polarities that need to be managed. So we're going to look at each of these 4 criterion of problems or polarities in the context of Agile transformations.
Okay, so let's start off by evaluating polarity test number 1. Is the difficulty ongoing? Well, the Agile Manifesto was published almost 20 years ago today, and a whole industry has formed around Agile transformations. So I would expect that if this problem was solvable, then we would have many shining examples of companies who have eliminated their Agile war zones through complete and total Agile transformations. But let me share with you a few items from the 2020 State of Agile report from version 1 to demonstrate that this doesn't seem to be the case. 95% of respondents on that survey said that their organizations are practicing Agile, while at the same time, a whopping 82% indicated that not all of their company's teams have adopted Agile practices. So taken another way, I can expect this to mean that I would expect a mix of both Agile and Waterfall in at least 82% of the organizations that are practicing software development globally. So I guess that's the glass is half empty bad news. But that also potentially means that 18% of the software companies out there are supposedly doing Agile really well, right? Surely those companies have found a way to eradicate Waterfall with a consistent and enterprise-wide approach to agility, right? Well, it looks like even the best among us haven't figured it out, because the survey then goes on to indicate that agility in these companies is still largely confined only to IT development and operations. And so, meaning the rest of those companies outside of just, those few departments is still using traditional approaches, and we can expect to find an agile war zone in those companies too. And so for all the agile coaches, transformation approaches, scaling frameworks, whatnot, that exist, we still haven't really figured this transformation thing out. And so, to answer the question of is the difficulty ongoing, we would assert that the answer is yes. So if we move forward to polarity test number 2, are the alternatives interdependent? So what that means is there some type of interdependent relationship between Agile and Waterfall? And there's a couple ways that we can look at this question. The first one is that if you think about it, we can't actually have Agile without some Waterfall. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we work in an Agile way, this iteratively and incrementally, we're really just doing a series of mini waterfalls. And you might say, hold on, Erkan, aren't mini waterfalls an Agile anti-pattern? And I've read all those blogs, and I've held that perspective for a while as well. But a couple things about that is, one, in the latest 2020 update to the Scrum Guide, there's an admission that each sprint is a mini project. And if we take a look at Scrum, and looking at Scrum can be helpful because it dominates the industry with 58% of all Agile teams using it, while the next closest method, Scrumban, is only used by 10%. We can see that each iteration is really nothing more than a phased project, where a team first starts with requirements gathering. That's the backlog refinement. Then they do a planning and design phase. That's their sprint planning. Then they have an execution phase. That's their sprint. And finally, they have a verification phase. That's the sprint review. And then this cycle repeats every few weeks, and then repeats again. But the interdependence actually works the other way around as well, where we can't have Waterfall without some Agile. If you think about it, every Waterfall project that we've seen, at least, has always had some sort of change management process built into it, so that they could continuously update their plans as more was learned along the way. Now, while much is made of the high cost of project management's change processes, this is the Waterfall way of leveraging the upsides of agility, because without at least some agility or the ability to learn and adapt to our environment, the purely Waterfall company would simply cease to exist. And so at this point, I just want to point out a paradox that we're going to come back to later on. So I'll invite you to hold it loosely maybe at this point in the talk. But it's that Agile and Waterfall are mutually inclusive and interdependent opposites. So not only can we not have Agile without Waterfall, but the more we favor one, the less we're going to have the other. So, to our question here, is there an interdependent relationship between Agile and Waterfall? We're hopefully putting forward a few reasons as to consider why the answer might be yes. So let's move forward to polarity test number 3. Are the upsides of both poles, in this case Agile and Waterfall, are they necessary? Do we need them? Do we want them? Do we seek? Are they sought after to some degree? Again, we believe the answer is yes, and one of the best ways to demonstrate this is by looking directly at the values from the Agile Manifesto that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So we'll populate those on the screen here. Now, on the left-hand side of these values, we have the values that Agilists want more of, and on the right, we have values that Agilists generally want less of, and tend to typically be more aligned with values that we would see in traditional or Waterfall organizations. Now, the upside to the agile items on the left here, I'm going to say those are obvious, because if they weren't necessary, we wouldn't see 95% of software companies globally trying to do agile and trying to capture the benefits of these values. But the upsides of the waterfall items on the right, they're also actually just as important, because if you think about it, without any processes and tools, we wouldn't actually have Scrum or management systems, or, insert your favorite framework. Without any documentation, we'd simply incur the waste of relearning over and over again. Without contracts, it'd be very difficult for us to have customer relationships. And without any planning, we simply wouldn't have sprints, because they always start with a plan. And so the Agile Manifesto, even has this famous line that we wrote on the bottom of the screen here that says, while there's value to the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. And so, a couple things I want to point out here is, one, this should resolve polarity test number 3, that there's at least some degree of value to both sides of the argument here. And also just that the often recognized genius of this Agile Manifesto is that it acknowledges that all values come in pairs. But as you're going to see in the next few slides,
I thought it was all the beer that they drank when they...
There was a lot of beer and skiing too, actually. We need to have more conferences like that, actually. As you'll see, as Brock will talk you through in the last polarity test here, one of the biggest assertions that we're making in this talk is that favoring one side over the other, as we do in the Agile Manifesto, presents a very, very big problem from the perspective of polarity management.
Yeah, and so the last test that we have here for is it a problem to be solved or polarity to manage, is that of will overfocus on one pole undermine the greater purpose? And so the answer to this in our context is also yes. And we're going to look at a couple of challenges that organizations face with respect to Waterfall and Agile to see this in action, okay, as we kind of go through here today. And so we'll start off with our first case study. And we're going to share 4 case studies with you today that each highlight the dynamics of polarities. Each of the case studies focuses on one of the 4 value pairs from the Agile Manifesto. So case study number 1 you see here starts off with the individuals and interactions and processes and tools polarity, in which this particular organization favored the individuals and interactions pole. And so the client that we have here is a startup company that had grown to roughly 500 employees. Their product was focused on corporate giving and volunteering solutions. And things like social causes, diversity, inclusion are a very important part about who this company is as an entity. The situation they found themselves in is that the growth that they had been experienced, as well as their culture, had led to slow decision-making and very expensive meetings. There's a need in this organization to include everyone in discussions and to make decisions by consensus. And that's kind of a result of their culture and their history over time. Leadership of the organization started to call this out as an inefficiency that needed to be addressed. HR even put in meeting guidelines and protocols to make sure that there's clear agendas for meetings, attendance lists made sense, things like that. There were documented outcomes from each of the meetings and had action steps. They even went so far as to provide formal training for all staff on how to properly facilitate a meeting. So what happened for this particular client? Well, favoring individuals and interactions for most of this company's history led to that slow decision-making and expensive meetings as the organization grew. Leadership and HR tried to counteract this by formalizing meetings through protocols, training, and documented outcomes. This led to reduced ownership in the organization since, well, I wasn't involved in that decision. Nobody asked my opinion. And as soon as the organization became aware of the reduced ownership and alignment, they quickly refocused on the individuals and interactions pole, effectively leaving the organization in the downside of the pole they had favored the most. And so we'll move on to case study number 2. And here we're looking at the working software and comprehensive documentation polarity from the Agile Manifesto. And we have a well-established Fortune 500 company from the Canadian energy sector. This organization has a very traditional culture and organizational hierarchy, and they accomplished work generally in the context of projects that had definitive start and end dates and kind of traditional project management throughout. This client understood that there was now a need to take a different approach to some of the work that they do in order to keep up with the innovation that their competitors were putting out. And so they desired to move some segments of their business into taking more of a product-centric approach rather than a project-centric approach. So they brought in Agile coaches to work with an internal team to design, build, and test that product-centric approach that they were wanting to try out. Well, due to the traditional history of this organization and the inertia that history created, the organization leaned to favoring upfront learning in an effort to reduce uncertainty, which created a need for comprehensive documentation before changes to the system could be made. The vast amount of documentation and approvals required caused a slowdown in the results that the team was able to achieve, and ironically, led to missing out on opportunities for learning. See, the organization just wasn't ready to embrace the working software side of the polarity, no matter how hard the Agile coaches and transformation team pushed them to do so. One reason for this is that as the team just started building stuff and learning through experimentation, leadership became uneasy with that and with decisions that were being made that had the perspective of lack of clear governance on those decisions, which in turn led the organization to move back to the comprehensive documentation pole very quickly, causing them to receive the downside of that pole. These first 2 examples center around favoring one pole, and that by doing so, the organizations involved receive the downside of that pole. It's important to note that continuing to favor just one pole and doing so to a large degree will eventually lead to receiving the downsides of both poles. And so what you have just observed through these first 2 case studies is what happens when you overfocus on one pole. And this is what is referred to as the one pole myth. And the myth states that if we focus solely on one pole, we are able to get the upside of that pole without any of the downsides of either poles. Now, the reality is that by favoring or overfocusing on one pole, we actually only get the downside of that pole. And if we hold onto that pole for long enough, we end up getting the downside of both poles. For example, and just as we saw from case study number 1, we might stick closely to individuals and interactions because we fear reduced ownership in decisions. But we stick to that pole so tightly that we create a culture of consensus decision-making, which slows us down in getting anything done and leads to blame and finger pointing, reduced ownership and accountability, which is the downside of the processes and tools pole, which we were trying to avoid in the first place. So let's recap based on the case studies we've provided so far. Is the difficulty ongoing? So yes, our industry has yet to consistently implement successful agile transformations in organizations. Are the alternatives interdependent? Yes. Agile frameworks include defined processes within them. Erkan showed how Agile can't exist without Waterfall and vice versa. Agile and Waterfall, as he mentioned, are mutually inclusive and interdependent opposites. Not only can we not have Agile without Waterfall, but the more we favor one, the less we have of the other. Are the upsides of both poles necessary? Yes. Even as described in the Agile Manifesto, there is value in both sides of the polarities that organizations must manage in order to be successful. And will overfocus on one pole undermine the greater purpose? Yes, our experience and the first two case studies we've shared tell us that overfocus on one pole leads to the downside of that pole and eventually the downsides of both poles.
So we just spent the first bit of this presentation making a case for Agile and Waterfall being a polarity to manage. But we're not going to spend too much time putting Agile and Waterfall up on a polarity map directly, because we believe that this is actually a meta polarity that contains many other smaller polarities within it. And it can be more immediately useful and practical for organizations exploring agility to manage these polarities individually based on specific challenges that they're facing. And so the 4 polarities listed in the Agile Manifesto, plus the dozen or so that are listed on the screen right now, are just some of the polarities that are out there. And once we become aware of that polarities exist, we start to notice them absolutely everywhere. But keep in mind that not all polarities are worth our effort to manage consciously. And so our suggestion then is to look at the business objectives that are behind each Agile transformation and first understand what polarities are at play here so that you can then select the most impactful leverage points to manage consciously. So here's a situation that might sound familiar, and it's similar to the question that Milan had about organizations that are kind of flip-flop back and forth, trying to chase a solution to a problem that can't be solved. And so the situation goes something like this. So let's say you're working in a company that uses a traditional waterfall approach to build products, and the time it takes to deliver new versions of that project to market and product market just kind of keeps on increasing to the point where now your releases are measured in years. So eventually you start losing market share to your competitors, and somebody comes up with the idea to solve this problem by doing an agile transformation. So your company brings in new leadership, they train everybody in Scrum, and then they fire anybody who threatens the new culture. So there's lots of excitement around the change at this point, but at a certain moment in time, people start to realize that Agile is actually a lot harder to implement than they thought. And, while it has delivered some benefits, it hasn't solved all of the problems that they thought it would. And in fact, now the company has a whole new set of problems to deal with. And so what does the company do? They get fed up waiting for results that, don't seem to be happening fast enough. And they start to view Agile as, just not as practical as we thought it would. And they start to view the transformation as a mistake. So they bring in new leadership again to fix the problem, but this time they do a large transformational change effort all the way back to the place that they came, this time valuing pragmatism and planning and measuring twice and cutting once and that type of thing. And now this cycle that repeats endlessly back and forth like this is unfortunately very common. When big organizational change efforts favor one pole over the other, they end up only in the downside of that pole, as we saw from Brock's example, due to the one pole myth. So then another change effort takes place in the opposite direction, again favoring only one pole, but this time it's the other one, and we get another one pole myth, but this time inverted, and then the cycle just repeats. Now, this is a dynamic that Barry Johnson likes to call the polarity two-step. And it's unfortunate because we spend most of our time in the downsides of the poles. We alienate people in our organizations unnecessarily, and we generate lots of costly resistance that's completely avoidable, such as the resistance that we had discussed at the start of this presentation with the Agile war zone. And so the point we want to make here is that by seeing either pole and looking at its upside as a solution or more important than the other is actually a setup for it to be called a mistake later on. And that's exactly what the Agile Manifesto is setting us up to do with its use of the word over. And this is a big problem because as Agilists, our industry has been in this unbalanced crusade in favor of one pole over the other in an unwinnable war for the last 20 years. This is why we say that Agile versus Waterfall is not a problem to solve, but a polarity to manage. Instead, we drop the word versus and we look at this polarity as Agile and Waterfall. But here's the good news. Dynamics in polarities are highly predictable. And when we become aware of these dynamics, we're able to manage them in such a way as to spend the majority of the time in the upsides of the two poles rather than in the downsides, such as we see happening here in the polarity two-step.
Okay, fine. So we can't have the upside of just one pole from a polarity because of the one pole myth. Well then, I'll set up my company and processes in such a way as to get the upsides of both poles at once. Unfortunately, this too is not possible. Since the two poles are opposites, it's not possible to have them both at the same time. This is called the merged pole myth. And there was a comment in the chat there, Mark, this is what I was talking about there. So this might help answer the question that you had. But when we try to get both upsides at the same time, we actually end up getting both downsides instead. So the example we have here is given that our greater purpose is breathing. You know, looking at the merge pole myth in the context of the polarity inhale and exhale. If we try and inhale while we're exhaling, which is aiming for the upside of both poles, we get neither upside. Instead, we accumulate CO2 and use more oxygen than we're breathing in, giving us the downside of both poles. And we see companies doing this all of the time. We're going to do Agile, they say, but you have to tell us when it's going to be ready and what we'll get on the other end. We're going to do Agile, they say, and the team is empowered, but managers and architects still have the final say. We're going to do Agile, they say, and learn through experimentation, but you better not fail. The merged pole myth, or the worst of both worlds, is what we think of when we hear terms like Watergile or Scrumfall, those types of things. Now, the reality here is that when organizations try to get the upside of both Agile and Waterfall at the same time, they end up with the downsides of both poles, missing out on the benefits of Agile while eroding the clarity and rigor of Waterfall. And so our case study here on the merged pole myth focuses on the customer collaboration and contract negotiation polarity from the Agile Manifesto. And so here we have the client here is a small boutique consulting firm. They were founded about 4 years ago and they specialize in Agile coaching and training. And now being new to the industry and in a quest to achieve some level of income certainty, this organization valued signing contracts with their clients. But because they were an Agile consulting firm and wanted to walk the talk, they also valued customer collaboration. So they attempted to get both poles at the same time by having customers sign contracts that focused only on the collaborative relationship between the client and the consultant. Well, as you can expect, by trying to get both poles at the same time, what they feared about each pole became true, and they received the downsides of both poles. Conversations with potential clients were still contentious over contract terms. And since they hadn't discussed pricing up front, the consulting firm didn't feel like they were being paid fairly.
Okay, so feels like we're in a bit of a pickle here. If we favor one pole, we get the one pole myth, and we end up with just the downside of that pole. So if we try to do the right thing and we favor both poles at the same time, we end up with the merged pole myth and we get the downside of both poles. So how do we manage polarities well then? Well, it all starts with being willing to take on multiple perspectives, and we'll demonstrate that with an example. So take a look at the picture that we have up on the screen here. This is a famous optical illusion that you've likely come across before, where we have a picture of a goblet in the middle in black there, separated by two faces on either sides there in white. Now notice that without the faces, the goblet in this picture can't exist. And vice versa, the opposite is true as well. Now, maybe we're the type of people who value goblets over faces. And so we make the goblet bigger and we make the faces smaller. But when we value the goblets too much, we lose both the goblets and the faces altogether. And so here we have another paradox, a set of mutually interdependent and inclusive opposites that are creating a polarity to manage. Now, you might have been the type to have seen the faces first, or you might have been the type to have seen the goblet in the middle first. But notice that both the goblet and the faces cannot both be perceived at exactly the same time. And in fact, this is something that Robert Desimone from MIT's McGovern Institute of Brain Research was able to prove, that our brains are only capable of holding one of these two perspectives at any one time. So either the goblet stands out and is clear, or the faces do. However, once we've seen them both at least once, we do have the option to easily switch between the two perspectives by making a conscious intention about which perspective we're going to take on at any moment. And so both perspectives are accurate, but only partially. And we really like this picture because it can help us make the distinction between accuracy and completeness. When we are able to take on the perspective from only one pole in a polarity, then it's our incompleteness combined with our conviction that we see the whole picture that can be the source of a potential problem and the source of a potential war zone, if you will. Now, as an example, if I tell you that you're wrong because there's no goblet in the picture, and you tell me that I'm wrong because there's no faces, then there's going to be no end to our argument. One of us is going to need to switch perspectives in order for us to progress in our discussion. But who goes first? Someone is going to have to recognize that this is a polarity to manage and say, hey, maybe this is not a situation in which we have either a goblet or two faces. Maybe this is a situation in which we should be looking for both the goblet and the faces. Maybe we're both accurate. And so paradoxically, our opposition with one another can turn into collaboration when we're able to switch from the statement of, I don't see what you're seeing, to help me to see what you're seeing. And the point we want to make here is that either or thinking can be supplanted with both and thinking to manage polarities well. And so grounding this in the individual and team polarity example that we looked at earlier, notice that on the right-hand side there's a parallel between seeing the two diagonal quadrants in the right, on the picture on the right, and seeing the two faces in the optical illusion on the left. Now, just like the first picture, we can only take on one perspective from our polarity map at a time. Usually, we're only able to see the upside of our favorite pole and the downside of the pole that we're afraid of, that we're trying to move away from, while being completely blind to the fact that there's actually a downside to over applying our favorite pole, and that there's actually an upside to the pole that we're afraid of. And so in the example that we have on the screen, we can see the upside of valuing an individual and the downside of valuing a team. But with a little bit of courage and maybe a lot of courage, we do have the option of intentionally taking on the opposite perspective. And if I click my screen here, we can see what happens when we do that, where we can see the downside of our favorite pole and that there's actually an upside to the opposite pole that we're afraid of. And unfortunately, just as we saw in the Agile war zone example, there's often a very serious and costly confrontation that takes place because a both and polarity is treated like an either or problem to solve. And people only bother to take on one perspective or another. So polarities are unavoidable and unsolvable. And so the question is not if we're going to manage them well, but how, or if we're not going to manage them, but how well are we going to manage these polarities? And so here's 5 skills that you can use to manage polarities well. The first skill is knowing when you have a polarity to manage rather than a problem to solve. And you can put the skill into action by answering those 4 questions in the polarity test that we started off this presentation with. The second skill is knowing that there's an upside and a downside to each pole. And you can put this one into practice by simply drawing an X on a piece of paper and writing out the positives and negatives to both sides of the equation. So filling out a polarity map. Skill 3 is maintaining a sensitivity to the downsides as they're experienced. And so what we mean by that is simply asking yourself, well, which quadrant of this polarity map am I in right now? Am I enjoying the upside of my current perspective? Or maybe have I held on to this perspective a little too long and we're getting the downsides of over applying it. Maybe the moving walkway has shifted us into the downside. And then skill number 4 is a willingness to shift as needed. And so this is where all of the courage takes place. This is where we need to be able to willing to say, you know what, I'm actually going to completely switch perspectives and I'm going to drive from the downside of my favorite pole into the scary, the unknown place of the upside of the opposite pole that I might have been fearing. And then number 5 is knowing how to talk to your opposite and mediate between opposites. So we like to use the metaphor of walking a tightrope as one that's a lot like managing polarities well. Now, a tightrope walker that we have pictured on the slide here, you can imagine he is acutely aware that there's both an upside and a downside towards, leaning towards one side or the other too much. And so what does he do? He's going to fully shift his perspective and either lean left or lean right when he's gone too far to one side or the other. And just when he's just learning to walk a tightrope, you can imagine that his shifts are going to be really extreme from one end to the other, correcting some of the mistakes he's made. And that's just like the polarity 2-step example that we saw organizations doing with these large change efforts, trying to fix these problems and to correct these mistakes. But as the tightrope walker becomes more skilled in his craft, his shifts between perspectives become smaller and smaller, and eventually they become barely perceptible. And so that is the metaphor that we want you to keep in mind as we talk you through our final case study for the night. And this one is of a polarity that was managed well in a company that we worked with. And so this company was able to listen to the early warning signs that they were slipping into the downside of each pole and then switch perspectives early enough such that they were able to spend the majority of their time in the upsides of the 2 poles. And so for this case study, we're looking at the last polarity from the Agile Manifesto that we haven't looked at yet, which is responding to change and following a plan. So this is a company that was founded 20 years ago in the energy sector. And they've been doing Agile for 15 years. So they have a really mature implementation. Now, we're going to start this case study in the upside of responding to change, because this organization had Scrum teams that were fully empowered to innovate and work directly with their clients. Leadership was comfortable with high levels of ambiguity, and they had a lot of trust that, while they didn't know exactly what would finally emerge from the customer collaboration that teams were having, they believed that value was being created, and so they were content. But what happened? While their general tact of allowing solutions to emerge was working well, they also noticed that at times they would need to plan and meet commitments. And one of those was their annual user conference, where customers wanted to know what was going to be demoed before they confirmed attendance and before they agreed to send their people across the world and incurred all those costs to attend. But when the company resisted to committing to demo any particular scope by the deadline, because they're agile, they received an early warning sign that they had been favoring the responding to change poll at the expense of the following a plan poll, which for them was that signups for their user conference were unacceptably low. And now this company was smart, and they understood that there was a polarity to manage here, and they were hyper aware that shifting to the downside of responding to change was something that they were experiencing. And so they were willing to switch perspectives quickly over to the following a plan poll. And they did this simply by working out the features that were sure to make a splash at the user conference, and then working backwards from the date that they needed to hit. And they ran that particular project a lot like a traditional waterfall one. Now I was there. I can attest that things were hectic at times. There was some overtime closer to the deadline, but they did complete the project on time, and customers were willing to show up as a result of the commitments they made. And the conference was a big success. And so here they are enjoying the upsides of the following a plan poll. But you can guess what happened next. After the conference, leaders kept asking their teams for detailed plans and holding them accountable to delivery dates, even though there wasn't any specific milestones that needed to be hit at that point. What happened was the leaders got a taste of the certainty that following and managing a plan provides, and they liked it. And so here they are now in the downsides of following a plan. But again, this company was aware enough to watch for those early warning signs, and they realized that they were slipping in the downside. And so they realized it was time to switch back to the agile pool and kind of get back to the roots and how they had been working things. And so what I want to point out with this yellow infinity diagram here is this is the first time we've seen an organization that is willing to switch poles immediately after they enter the downside. We're always going to experience some of the downside of each pole, but it's just a matter of how much. And the same thing is true for the upsides. We'll always experience some of the upsides, but the question is how much.
Which leaves us with the challenge facing most organizations in the world today, getting the upsides of both waterfall and agile, what we call integrated agile. To get more out of agility, you need to be willing to move away from it once in a while. See, the genius of the Agile Manifesto is that its creators recognize that all values come in pairs. And while the current manifesto recognizes that both are important, we've learned that you can't have both at the same time. The manifesto attempts to solve this dilemma by favoring one set of values over the other. This is over more thinking. But remember the one pole myth? Over more thinking is simply either or thinking in disguise. And either or thinking can only lead to the downsides of the values on the left. You see, the agile values are a crusade from the downside of a more traditional approach into the upside of agility, which is exactly what the software industry needed in 2001. But those values are only one half of a dynamic that needs to be managed because all values come in pairs. The other half is the inverse of the Agile Manifesto, where we value processes, documentation, contracts, and plans over the items on the left. By learning to manage both poles, organizations can maximize time spent in the upside of both poles. And that's why we're suggesting the Agile Manifesto could use a small upgrade. By replacing the word over, which promotes either or thinking, with the word and, we're promoting both and thinking. We recognize these values as polarities to manage and not problems to solve. We call this the Integrated Agile Manifesto because it reintegrates values that have been marginalized for some time. You can find out more about the Integrated Agile Manifesto at integratedagilemanifesto.org. We have a recording of this session as well as our slides up there. And there's also some additional principles and things that we've added to support this manifesto. Now you might be saying, but wait, Brock, that's blasphemy. You can't change the Agile Manifesto. It's a perfect, sacred, and unalterable document. Well, actually, the Agile Uprising recently did a podcast series where 14 of the 17 signatories of the Agile Manifesto contributed. And when they were asked, what advice would you give to the next generation of Agilists? The one message they had in common was not to take the Agile Manifesto as gospel and instead continue to build upon it. We hope that the Integrated Agile Manifesto honors their work and builds upon it in a way that will help companies manage the practical realities of existing in a mixed methods environment. We do have, Erica's probably sharing the link in the chat there. We also do have some resources on our slides that you can check out that might be helpful to you. And then the last thing is also a link for feedback. We're interested in feedback on our session, but also on the ideas in the manifesto itself. And so if you could just take that short survey, it only takes a couple of minutes, we'll post that in the chat for you. We're really interested in what feedback you have, ideas to share, things like that, that we can continue to integrate as we kind of continue to move forward with this idea. But with that, that brings us to the end of our session here. Really appreciate again the invite, Milan, and having us here. Thank you for that, and really appreciate all of you for coming out and being with us here today as we share. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you both. I don't know if you guys have a couple of minutes, and for those of you that want to stay to take some questions. I know the session, we used to have them for 75 minutes, then I think we shortened them but we're officially done here. But if you guys are open to stay a little, maybe for 10 minutes and see if there are any questions. I know there's at least one question here about how do we, Caden said, how do we get leadership to recognize that there are needs to balance approach to these polarities?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that question tells me that hopefully you got some value out of this, because you're like, oh, how do I share this with other people if I'm reading between the lines correctly? And so I would say start small. So you could discuss the concepts of polarity management around something small and innocuous, maybe something where there isn't actually a war zone formed around it yet. And then you can do a workshop. You can get a group of people together and you can simply fill out a polarity map together and then answer the question, well, what quadrant are we in right now? Are we experiencing the upside or the downside? How can we honor the other side's perspective? And then what do we want to do about that? What's interesting is when we shift from perspectives to one side to the other, we don't fire everybody who sees things a different way, because we know that we're actually going to be coming back again right away anyway, right? And so just a way to honor. Another tip that you might use is when talking with somebody who has the opposite perspective of you, where they're looking at only the downside of what you want to do. Maybe they're only looking at the downside of Agile, and they're looking at the upside of, you know, their practical planned and measured approach, is to simply talk to them using a polarity map, but reverse the order. So first acknowledging the that there's an upside to the way they see things, so that you see them the way they do, and then you know, mention that, hey, look, you know that there's fear around over applying this Agile thing. I know that if you know, we do it too much, or we do it in a certain way, these are the things we don't want to happen. And don't worry, I see that too. We're not going to go there. And then you can say, but you know what, at the same time, there is a downside to maybe continuing on the path that we are, right? And here's the reasons. And then only then, once you've kind of gone through the full map, do you bring them to the upside of where you want to bring them, and say, hey, you know, and so maybe there's an ask in there of, you know, maybe we can run a small experiment with Agile, or whatever it is that you're trying to convince them to do.
One other thing I'll add to that, Barry Johnson, his book, you know, he doesn't always refer to these as polarities. He calls them dilemmas as well. And so maybe tailoring your wording to the context will help with those you're talking with, because polarities, until you're introduced to the concept like this, it might be confusing. You don't know what that is. I think dilemmas, or maybe something else, people kind of understand that, right? That there are these different dilemmas that exist in the world that we have to manage and kind of deal with. And so I think that might be a little more accessible sometimes for you know, just any random person. Yeah.
Great. Kevin has another question. Curious if you have any ideas how to measure where an organization is among the polarities. So what have you guys done to kind of measure, or maybe when you're talking to organizations, what do you do in this situation when you're looking to measure?
So yeah, the key is watching for early warning signs that you're slipping into the downside. And sometimes it's possible to automate those. So if an organization is doing, you know, weekly pulse checks of its employees, you might see that engagement scores have dropped below a certain level. That triggers a conversation, or those types of things. But I guess it depends on the specific polarity that you're looking at. And I don't know, Kevin, if you had one in mind.
We're also big fans of self-assessments and helping organizations or teams or whatever assess themselves. And so if there is a particular polarity that they're focused on, or a set of polarities, you can just draw them up on the wall or the whiteboard.
Bro, who has time to do that?
Craft out the map and then just have them say, like, well, what are we experiencing right now might be the question, right? And you can see, are we experiencing the upside or the downside, and how are we doing, right? And yes,
we're gonna say something, I think.
Yeah, I just kind of in some of the earlier slides, you talked about kind of measuring like how many meetings and how many forced meetings are. Do you think that would be a good measure? Kind of how many meetings are teams kind of trying to go through?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. You know, you wanna also watch for, you know, whatever measured gets kind of gamed sometimes, and these types of things. So that might be a good experiment or a place to start. I do like Brock's technique probably the best, of just simply asking a group of people, you know, what's your sense? Are we in the upside or the downside? Like, people can usually feel that, to the point where it doesn't always need to be so rationalized, I guess, into numbers and that type of thing. But you can take it there, I guess, depending on the people you're working with.
And Kevin, you know, given, you know, that I'm a little bit familiar with your situation, like, you know, for smaller companies, in a sense, you could have a not necessarily whiteboard, but this is something like, you know, you can facilitate a monthly retrospective, right? Explain the concept, and then just have people put stickies, or, you know, like on a Miro or mural or whatever, I always get those two. But those tools, where you can actually just get feedback from participants. I just did that something similar with group of trainers where we work for one company, and there was, maybe like 20 of us. And we did something similar where we just kind of gauge where we think we are. So I think, it was something similar to quadrants like this. And that worked really well, where people kind of vote almost where they think we are. And if misaligns, like Brock, why did you, I wouldn't think that you put it down there. Tell us a little bit more about why do you feel that we're, let's just say in this space. So there is a way. I think it's just finding time for a lot of these things. But that's why I said, who has time for it? It's like we're always too busy working on other things.
I mean, I think retrospectives are a great opportunity because sometimes we forget about those as coaches or scrum masters, right? It's built into the process. We have it available to us.
Or the retrospectives are done just at the team level, right?
Yeah.
If so.
But you can, someone brings up something that they're struggling with or a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, great. What's the other side of that, right? And then you put that up, and then you do your 4 quadrants, and then away you go. So that it doesn't have to be complicated or fancy. And yes, no more whiteboards. I get it. Online.
So maybe one more question. Teres has a question, and maybe we can finish with this. Can you say more about the lack of polarity due to other issues, like something which is often not talked about enough? For example, lack of cultural intelligence, competence within organizations.
Do you have an example on what you're referring to? Yes. Was that Terrence? Yes. Lack of polarity. I guess what I'm stuck on is, what do you mean by lack of polarity?
It looks like he's connecting, so maybe.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep, now we can.
Oh, okay, sorry. Let me, okay, hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, from my understanding, and maybe I was wrong, I was kind of in and out of the meeting, apologize, but, when you talk about, from my understanding of polarity or having this balance, for successful business and
Oh, we may have lost him. He might have connection issues. That's probably why he was in and out. Okay, well, it's I would say it's probably a good time to wrap up. I did record this by start recording maybe like 6, 7, 8 minutes in. So I'll see how it comes out, and I might send it to you guys, and if you guys are okay, I might post it to Agile Maine YouTube. And again, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for taking time and joining us for this discussion. And we're gonna have lightning talks, I believe, on January 13th and another day. So we'll be sending an email out about that probably later on this week.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Well, thank you again for having us. This has been great.
Yeah. Thank you guys. See you soon. Yeah. Bye.